Le timing est très serré. On commence à 14 heures pétantes, donc je vais laisser la parole à Agnès Saal tout de suite et puis ensuite.
I'm going to give the floor to Agnès Saal, and then I'll say a few words as we start this lecture. So please take place as quickly as possible, and we will begin with our discussion. And thank you for coming today.
Merci Fanny. Un an après, même salle, même lieu.
Thank you, Fanny. A year later, same event, same place, same issues with a little bit of progress over the past year and following the very deplorable stake-taking exercise that we had conducted in terms of the role of women in photography. So what can we say today? First, that the statistical analysis of data is something that we know is very important. We can't just go on the basis of intuition or feelings. We need to go from on the basis of evidence and quantified evidence. And the figures don't lie. They're much better off thanks to the fantastic work that Marie Daucher and Fanny have conducted. I can't applaud, my hands are full, but we will hear a presentation that's very thorough, but that we believe to be still insufficient. We think it's possible to go even further in gathering and analyzing figures, quantitative data. So what we have done is to add to our area of research some institutions, some national institutions, such as the Bibliothèque de France, the Centre Pompidou, the CNAP, because we think it's very interesting or very important today to look at how photographic collections feature women and make it possible to discover women. It's true for the stock, but also the flow, that is acquisitions year in, year out. The acquisitions are made by these major public institutions. So we're highly pleased to note that there's a great deal of interest in these institutions at the very highest level. And while we haven't had the time to pull together all of the necessary data, we will have that information in just a few months' time. And this is why our intention is not to wait for next year, that is, not to wait for Paris Photo 2020. In 6 months, before the summer, we will organize a new event. It might be a symposium. It might be a bit longer than just the 2 hours we have to speak this afternoon. And so we can look more closely at the situation and to clearly look at the result of all of our undertakings. So what are the actions that have been developed? First of all, what we do with the figures. We know, first of all, that in schools, young women and girls are in greater numbers than boys. And we know that when it comes to accessing the profession, access to notoriety and visibility, somehow women simply disappear. And of course, we need to analyze the causes of this phenomenon and then to find out what can be done to correct the situation. So the measures that can be applied is something that we've thought a lot about with the support of the photography division of the Department for the Support of the Arts. We worked in a very small group to determine what those measures might be. And amongst the core measures that can be implemented that exist in other countries, for instance, in the United States or in other areas, for instance, audiovisual, we think it's necessary to develop a very simple tool in the form of a platform, a site, that would basically list all of the women today who are actively involved in photography, regardless of the type of photographs they make, be it photo reportage or art photography, all forms of photography. And this platform would make it possible for women to be identified, to give any useful information, and of course to include their portfolio so that they're on the one hand more visible, and even if the word is about a bit shocking, to be more appealing, more attractive. and to counteract or to fight back against the argument that we're faced with all the time on the behalf of programmers for festivals or institutions, programmers who constantly say, yes, of course, they would like to program women, but how to find them? There are no women. And we know that that simply is not true. And this platform that we want to develop and to have operational as quickly as possible and to make it as easy to use as possible. So we're talking about the next few months, and we will find the ways and means to do this, including the financial resources. Before, I was talking about a comparable site that you may have seen. It's the site of expert women in audiovisual. We know that France Télévisions and Radio France set up this platform with the support of the company EGAE. This can be a model for us because the women who are visible on this site have a much greater facility to gain recognition. And the reports of the CSA, the Higher Audiovisual Authority in France, attest to this. And there are more women now, even if it isn't absolute parity. So in the world of cinema and television, women have made advances. So that's the first very concrete and practical thing that we can do. And then the second possible measure. This involves the world of education. Schools, art schools, architecture schools, design schools are basically where people who work in culture and visual arts are trained. And there's a great deal that needs to be done in these schools. Even though the student body is majority made of women, they're somewhere around 58% of the student body. Nonetheless, there still is a lot of work to be done. And I'm very pleased that at the Higher School of Photography in Arles, there is a very proactive work being done with Martha Gilly, and I know that she's been committed to this fight for a long time. So what exactly have we done in the field of higher education for culture? We've asked all the schools to have a gender parity charter. It says, how can one sort of suffuse the whole program with a culture of equality? Who teaches? Who is taught? Right now, the faculty is, for the most part, made up of men. Then, next question, how do the juries that select students who are admitted or students who get their diplomas are composed? Here again, there has to be absolute parity, gender equality. How can we prepare young women better to the professions that these schools prepare for? They follow the same curriculum, and they're just as successful as their fellow students who are boys. But we know that somehow afterwards they don't carry on. So they need to be better prepared, more prepared, and we have a lot of tools, coaching, mentoring, very specific measures that are aimed at women. And then there's one whole dimension that simply cannot be neglected or overlooked, which is sexism and harassment. And recent events have shown clearly that this is really a scourge that applies to many areas, or is found in many areas, of course, filmmaking, but also within our own administrations. Here there is a phenomenal amount of work to be done. First of all, to fight against denial, cowardice, and hypocrisy that have been the rule for decades, and then to develop tools. So we developed a special unit against discrimination, which is open up to all faculty and administrative staff in the schools, but also to 37,000 students who come through these various schools. So we'll have basically information sheets that tell the management of the schools what their responsibilities are, criminal responsibilities and disciplinary responsibilities, and then to make sure that any testimony, and I can assure you that this will be done, all testimony or bearing witness will have consequences. we will no longer hear the arguments, we don't have evidence, that nothing can be done, that this is in the private sphere, it's outside of school. This is not true. We know exactly how much power some men can exercise or some women. The reverse can be true, but in numbers, it's a very smaller proportion. We know full well all of the power that in art schools, architecture schools, photography schools, some can wield over us, those who have power and simply fail to understand that they're abusing their power. So beyond the schools, and beyond everything that has been done so far and that is starting to yield results, for example, the training that is being provided by the IGAE company that provides training for staff of the Ministry of Culture, of the schools of higher learning, but also in the student body to identify, to better prevent, and to better fight against sexist and sexual violence and harassment. We need training, and we need the tools to do that training. And then there's a third area in which we're going to work, even though, alas and unfortunately today, I cannot tell you specifically what is going to be done. But we believe that amongst the obstacles that are keeping women back and has a lot to do with single-parent families, whether it's a woman with children or men with children, we have identified a specific obstacle or a difficulty. It has to do with the presence of children at different moments in one's career, for instance, for a residency or for a reporting mission. What can these single parents do? And we see all too often that women, and more often than not it is women we're talking about, are simply slowed down in their professional advancement because leaving for residency or going abroad on a reportage is something that becomes impossible simply because they have dependents that they have sole responsibility for. So we have to find the ways to facilitate childcare. This has been done in another area, that is women who work in show business and who have intermittent contracts. And we hope to find a solution to provide for the care of these children. We don't have any miracle, formulas, but this obstacle along the way that's already sufficiently difficult, well, that this particular obstacle can be dealt with. So these are a few of the things that we're doing, and I admit it readily. It's not enough. We haven't reached all of the objectives that we had set for ourselves, because then there's the whole advocacy work, educating people, educating those and particularly those of the masculine persuasion who are in control. Why? Simply because they're heading up the institutions that could show women's work, or because they are directors of festivals that fail to show women enough. And there's the tireless work of advocacy and educating and pressure sometimes, especially when there's public subsidies involved. It's obvious that as a counterpart or in exchange for subsidies, the Ministry of Culture has every right to expect that commitments be made and upheld, and not just moral undertakings, but something that basically then shows up in the actual programming. So that's a quick survey of what we want to put in place. And now I would like for us to hear Marie, who will talk about the results, the outcome of the fantastic work of analysis of data and data gathering that has been done.
Donc rebonjour, merci beaucoup Agnès pour
Good afternoon to everybody, and thanks, Agnès, for this very precise and clear presentation that you just made, this work that we've been involved in for several months now. So last year we came before you once again at the invitation of the Ministry of Culture and by photo to raise the question of the role of women in photography. This was a new topic for me last year, and so I basically delved into this issue and I brought together a group of experts to shed different lights on the very blatant difficulty for women photographers to take their rightful place. So a year later, I wanted to shed more light and to take a closer look at this data to try to understand better what's going on in this situation. It's not very happy. Marie Daucher, who's a photographer and very much of an advocate, seemed the right person to do this. So we can, in this way, take stock of the problem that doesn't spare any area of photography or culture. First of all, to get the figures. This is necessary if we want to understand, through the very good analysis of the sociologist Irene Jonas, the mechanism whereby women simply become invisible or disappear. From their training programs, where we have more girls than boys, then we see that there are only 25% of artists who are exhibited in the main venues. And this is something that we see once again today here at By Photo. And I also took a look at what's going on in other European countries. And there the situation is hardly any better than here. In the Netherlands, where Delphine Bedel will be talking about the initiatives by the Council of Visual Arts. In the UK, where Fast Forward Women in Photography with Anna Fox and others shed more light on the problem. And then in Africa, where Annie Kofi is working to showcase African women photographers. This is far too little to develop and exchanges amongst ourselves because there's so many issues at hand. But we hope that awareness is beginning and that we're starting to see a reversal of the trend. The history of photography is not so long to repair it, to not be able to repair it and restore balance. I'd like to thank the Ministry of Culture for once again trusting us and the whole team, to all of them. And of course, By Photo, Christophe Wisner and Agathe Moulonguet and others, without whom we wouldn't have been able to develop this program. And I would also like to tell you there's an observatory to look at gender balance in the photography ecosystem developed by Les Filles de la Photo with support from the Ministry of Culture, and in its roadmap, Equality by 2022, that we will be reporting on February 5th here at the Beaux-Arts. So altogether, we must pursue concrete actions in the field. And Agnès Saal said in her introductory remarks, we collectively will be working to this end. One last thing before I turn you over to our guests. Do not leave this room at the end of the lecture, because I'll call Dr. Del Barrette, the president of the Royal Photographic Society, who will award the medal 100 Heroines of Photography to the tremendous artist Orlan. Thank you for your attention.
Est-ce qu'on peut changer le visuel? Merci.
Et donc là, je fais comment?
Tu parles?
Oui, je parle. Je parle. Je parle et j'appuie ici. OK. Alors, merci Fanny pour cette invitation.
Thank you, Fanny. I have a lot of thanks to give Marie-Hélène, Agnès Saal, the members of La Part des Femmes, friends, and all of those who have exchanged with me throughout this investigation. I'm going to present, in a way that's far too succinct, gender data on several aspects of photography. I've used two types of resources. Those come from the INSEE, the National Institute of Statistics, the CIREC, and the Ministry of Culture, and figures I came up with by exploring the internet sites of festivals, awards, and institutions working in photography. I'll comment these figures, having as support the work on sociology and art carried out by Marie Buscato and my neighbor. Since this is going to be recorded, you can look at the slides later. Let me start with the more complex data and whose analysis made difficult because photographers are increasingly poor. This is figures that basically give us a photography of the population that we want to understand. So we have 22,000 persons who declare report being photographers. About half of them are less than 40, and 35% are women. Men and women would be equal in this age bracket, but they're a minority in the over 40 years old. The progression of photographers who have public insurance schemes don't report on this. Many photographers have now become self-employed so that they can bill for several different types of assignments because on average they have 3.5 jobs that are connected to photography. And 1/3 of photographers have additional salaried activity in photography or another area. This is especially true for women because the insurance scheme does not give them appropriate maternity leave. They are therefore no longer covered by the statistics, but this doesn't mean that they're no longer producing as photographers. In spite of a high level of educational attainment, their income is much less significant than those of their fellow men photographers. That is 1,400 for men, 1,000 for women. So that's a tremendous difference for sums that are not very high. In 2017, the 10% of photographers who were the best paid concentrate 40% of all income. These are mostly men over 40 years of age and living in the greater Paris area. I consulted a panel of 17 agencies and groupings. Close to 80% of photographers are men. 6 photography agencies represent 26% of men. So this is highly dominated by men. I've been given information by Hans Lucas that has 48% of women in France, and the response to calls for bid are clearly equal. Divergence, another grouping with 133 photographers, basically wanted to recruit women in spite of internal opposition, and those that have been hired seem to have been integrated successfully. And the reluctance to the integration of women is something that can be dealt with, and that's why I'm giving you these examples. I was talking about the level of educational attainment. So let's look at what's going on in our two schools, the schools in Arles and Louis Lumière in Saint-Denis. The program, the faculty is primarily men. Students are, female students are more numerous than boys, and sometimes they have diplomas in architecture, decorative arts, or fine arts. So this means that in teaching, there's really some blindness, and there's a seduction that's not truly desired. The constant reference to the history of photography that's andro-centered tells the graduates what will be the dominant colors that will be the references and the keys to maintain themselves in a professional environment. And it's this time that they'll be creating their networks that will ensure their careers in a far more efficient way than the only quality of the work they've done as students. Before they graduate, many women, without any reference during their studies, were simply going to go to positions that are peripheral and will go, for instance, to jobs such as curators or directors of art centers or restoration. Now, to illustrate this, here are a recent screen capture of the homepage of the major programs. We see that Arles, photographers are all equal behind the objective, or it's quite homogeneous. Saint-Denis, we really see men behind the lens, but in the Gobelin, we have a graduating class that shows the figures. We see many girls, but when we're talking about the page on training, we see that women are very stereotypically represented. Now let me continue on networks. Let's look who's at the head of these networks in 2019. Out of 38 centers of arts and institutions, we see a rebalancing between men and women at the head of the institutions over the course of the years. But when it comes to festivals, men are in the dominant position. The emblematic festivals are still directed by men. Jeux de Paume, MEP, Rencontre d'Arles, Visa pour l'Image, and Pompidou. The lack of women at the head of photographic institutions reinforces the stereotype of a Western male-dominated network, which encourages social homogeneity. So these networks are more favorable to men in terms of exposure, management, and curatorship. We selected 21 festivals, and we compared the situation over the last 5 years. We observed there's been an increase in the number of photographs exhibited, a drop of men, and an advancement of women, 2.3%, but that is still too little. In 2018, the collective La Part des Femmes publicly called on the director of Les Rencontres d'Arles on the fact that women were consistently poorly represented in the festival the last 50 years. And in 2019, the major individual or solo exhibitions were on a parity, and the presence of women were double throughout the festival. And thus, the director gave the proof that women were there in numbers, and the festival would not lose anything in terms of quality or number of visitors by observing gender parity. It's here to deal with another belief, mainly there are not enough women applying because they're simply lacking in boldness or ambition. The figures show that they apply and show in equal numbers to their fellow male colleagues in all sectors of emerging photography. But since they have more daily work to do, they simply don't go to those places that are not favorable to them and tend to invest themselves in competitions or institutions that are more receptive to women. This is true with the Centre National des Arts Plastiques, the CNAP, that buys, commissions, and helps visual artists and is very attentive to gender parity. The proportion of women, 27% in the collection, is hardly budging because mechanically this lag cannot be compensated by a strictly egalitarian policy. The last few years, spontaneous applications are almost on parity. So women are there and they're applying. Over the last 2 years, a little over half of all acquisitions by the CNAP were done from women, and the number of works that were purchased from women is also increasing. And commissions by the CNAP are done on a parity basis. Support for documentary photo to research and production are not used enough by women, and we have to broadcast the message that there's a political will for parity to allow talent to emerge and diversify points of view. There are other examples of collections that show that the share of women never goes beyond 27%. There's another hardcore belief whereby women are fewer, and that so logically they're in minority numbers in exhibitions. We saw that the figures on photographers are already very tenuous. I'd like to talk about 21 exhibitions taking place right now in France on the topic of engagement. It's the result of collaboration with the collection of the CNAPF, where we have 27% women, and the Diagonal Network, which brings together production structures and dissemination systems. It's a very active network. And I only talk about this event that doesn't really reveal anything about what's going on within each institution. We have 86% of the photos of the catalog that are by men. No woman has a monographic exhibition as compared to 4 for men, and 1 collaboration between a man and woman. 68% of curators are men. 75% of photographers exhibit are men. 8 shows have less than 25% women and 1 without any female photographer. 5 venues show more than 45% women. So it's possible an exhibition accounts for 88%, but the theme is half of the world. that on the familial pact represents 78% of men, which is something that's noteworthy when we know to what extent female artists are constantly being sent back to the question of maternity, domestic tasks, and they're just underrepresented. Let's hope that with the collection enriched by women's work and curators who will be more enlightened, the selections will better show the diversity of photographers in the upcoming years. Awards are a very important stepping stone in a career. We looked at 30 of these prizes for 10 years. Emerging photography represents 37% of all prizes. Women and men are in equality for 10 years. Since the 1960s, this part of the so-called emerging artists has become the target of cultural policy programs and patronage, but also for gallery owners, which set the maximal age at 40. The problem of ageism is something on top of the problems of having a family that is a problem for women. At 40, many of them simply drop off the radar, although they're still there. From 2010 to 2019, 36% of prizes were awarded to men. In 2019, that figure was 41%, an increase of 5 points, and that is considerable. They're still poorly represented in documentary prizes and photo reportages, whereas prizes that are from the manufacturers such as Leica and Hasselblad. Publishing a book is a necessary stepping stone in a career of photographer. We selected 4 prizes that reward photography books or writing on photography. This is a banner year, which we hope is marking a change. Organizers have been made aware of these problems through exchanges with militants. In 2019, the Nada Prize received 26% of women by books and awarded the prize to a woman, the 5th in 64 years. In A, they were 35%. They selected 24 women and they awarded prizes to 2 men and 2 women. The new HIP prize got 22%, and the result was on a parity. And it's the same with by Photo Aperture in 2018. However, only the first photo book of the year has a monetary award to the tune of $10,000. It has only been attributed to men since it was created 7 years ago. We passed on the message, but last night, once again, it's the men who won the prize, and this for the 8th time since the prize was created. Since we're here at By Photo, let's look at the art market. The committee of selection of the galleries this year is made up of 5 men, 2 women. Solo shows are 84% dedicated to men, and galleries show on average 75% of men. We see exactly the same sort of thing with emerging photo with a dedicated sector Curiosa, where women are slightly more represented than their fellow male colleagues. 4 metro stations away from here, Photo Fever has made it possible for galleries or convinced galleries to represent equal numbers of men and women. There are other items that had to be taken on board, aside from gender, social origin, and the origin of photographs. The lack of diversity is blatant and very disturbing in this respect. And I noticed this throughout my research, yet they exist. So as we see, there's some markers. The cursor has moved in 5 years thanks to this outstanding configuration. This because there are people who are fighting for it and institutions that are collaborating to move the lines. And this has to do with the diversity of the way we see the world, the way we represent our bodies, our lives, and the realities. And for all of this, photography is a very special tool. So here are a few milestones along the way. In November 2015, there's a first alignment of planets with a conference at the MEP and the eponym film Ni Vu Ni Connu, the female careers in photography, and the film Objectif Femme, along with a dual exhibit at the Musée d'Orsay and the Orangerie, Who's Afraid of Female Photographers. 3 years later, another milestone, the creation of the festival Les Femmes S'Exposent, the letter to the director of Les Rencontres d'Art, the roadmap on equality to the Ministry of Culture. Right now, photography historian Michel Poivart is signing the book 50 Years of French Photography. Made aware as early as 2014 to the issue of gender parity, he includes more than 40% of women, which is a whole change of paradigm in the historical books on photography. We should note that he's the only person who can conduct research in photography history, and that's far too few. History is a tremendous tool for emancipation and equality that benefits to all fields when it's inclusive. And this is why we're looking forward to the introduction to the World History of Female Photographers by Luce Lebert and Marie Robert next year. And I would like to thank you for your attention.
Merci Marie pour ce travail de fond et
Thank you, Marie, for this fundamental work.
Qui nous apporte un éclairage crucial sur toutes ces données.
Bonjour, donc photographe et sociologue.
Yes, I'm a photographer and sociologist. I have just carried out some research as to the health of photojournalists, and I already knew Marie, so I organized a sociological inquiry on women journalists at various ages with different trajectories to better understand what is going to take place with each and every woman. Let us give you some general data concerning men and women journalists. And there are differences between male and female journalists. The self-employed careers are different from staff journalists. They do not have the same hierarchical development. They need to be recognized. To better understand this recognition process, there are two levels: artistic work as such, and the management of this artistic work. Because when we speak of the recognition and revenues of photographers, it's not only a matter of competences and autonomy. It doesn't depend upon the photographer only. In fact, it all depends upon the world, or rather the market of photographies. So this is translated by publications, residences, monographic exhibitions, galleries, grants, awards. So when we speak of talent as source of recognition, is to forget that there is also a social dimension in the production of an artwork and the construction of this artwork. Now, my purpose was to update the mechanisms, which, as Marie has just demonstrated with figures, we see that indeed women photographers seem to vanish at the top end. Does it mean that women photographers did not answer all the selection criteria? Did they run up against obstacles in the course of their trajectory? What about their career? How can we decide between eviction and exclusion or self-exclusion? Of course, I cannot answer all the questions today, but the first results seem to highlight a accumulation of discriminating elements which progressively have an impact on the artistic choices of women photographers. They all face the situation differently. Some try to face, others try to survive, others transcend it, or invest elsewhere, because it all depends upon the family, horizon, origin, age, and inscription in the sociological landscape. Let me start with this sexism, which we call frontal sexism, in other words, harassment. When an art critic wishes to meet me, I come with all my portfolios, and after 30 minutes, he takes my hand and says that his hotel is next door. It's humiliating, and I feel humiliated each and every time, and I'm always trying to avoid this. All the women photographers who have been confronted with this frontal sexism are exhausted, are desperate, depressed, loss of energy. All these surprise attacks need to be faced. A new solution has to be found without, of course, violently facing the counterpower. So you have to find smart solutions, as in the case of going outside. I have a wedding ring, or I'm telling people that I'm furiously in love. So when men and women are confronted with the violence of the system, competition, they need to carry out a consistent work, a well-constructed portfolio, and think about their arguments. But a photographer who shows his images can think about the presentation of his work without thinking about his own presentation. He doesn't have to think about his own person. How should I dress? How should I seduce, etc. Because this sexism obliges women photographers to anticipate, to react without risking to be blacklisted. Forget about some festivals, and therefore they need to find solution and invest time and energy in solutions. If you are working on self-portraits or nudes, nothing seems to have changed since Victor Hugo wrote to his fiancée. This young person was an artist. This would suffice to ruin her reputation. It suffices for a woman to belong to a public. The public has the idea that this person belongs entirely to the public. So when it attacks your intimate life, it becomes a sort of open bar. If you speak about sex in your photographs, well, you might as well go for it. So they see that aspect of me in my work, and one thinks that everything's permitted. But looking into my pictures doesn't give you any right. There is another type of sexism in public spaces, in the street. A woman photographer who said, it's one of my first works in Marseille that I understood that you cannot just stand in the street awaiting something to happen. So women that go from one place to another, and only women, public women, are staying on the spot, just awaiting someone. So what are the images produced by women photographers? How is it going to limit their projects? Which place can they take in street photography? And since we are speaking of residences, you can't understand this if you don't understand that photographs made on the body, on the family, it wouldn't be a natural trend, but they work within this space which is close to them, which is the most accessible space to them. One of them said, for me, it's children that introduced a change. I'm not going to stay 3 months in residency. That is too difficult, even in summertime. I used to travel a lot, 5 or 6 times a year. Now I travel once a year. I take a lot of photographs, and my life has become my subject. They all need to face all the unsmiling faces when producing their work. Of course, they are still available to produce whatever it costs. But what is sent back to them is that man is always being blessed as a cultural man working on the same themes. You have spoken of the family pact as an example. if they have no children, they work at the same pace as men photographers, but still there is this suspicion of procreation. In the artistic imaginary, one considers that a woman has a fundamental choice to make, create or procreate. There have been maternity issues. They got less aggressive, had less energy. They couldn't exhaust all their possibilities, but reduce their resistance, their existence only to maternity is not enough. Why not leave a child with a husband to go working? I traveled once. My husband took care of my child. When I got back, he stopped everything. And when I say everything, I mean he stopped doing whatever. So one of my witnesses said that when she divorced, she had to get better organized to be able to travel. So trade-offs were to be decided upon. So she decided on regional projects. And this, of course, impedes an international career. So she has regional orders, but it's less chic. So they need to produce images, but also they need to publish, do a lot of networking, residency, and reporting. As soon as a child is there, time is missing to face all the activities contributing to this recognition. But there are other obstacles already mentioned by Agnès Saal, such as, for instance, choose a residency and stay in a residency with a child. So, of course, there are childcare possibilities, but it requires an individual management of priorities. In other words, they will have to limit their travels, limit their publications, competitions, or no more exhibitions. So it's a real approach à la carte. As if this were not enough, we must not forget that the social reference of a mother is still very present with institutions, childcare institutions. The director of the school of my son called me over and over again to tell me that my boy wasn't well enough, although I had told her that I had to travel to Russia. On Facebook, there is this small, funny drawing of two women in space, and there's a telephone line telling them that their child is at school and there's a problem and they should make themselves available. Careers, globally speaking, are no longer linear. A woman who has given birth or who will give birth is lost in terms of creation. The criteria such as age, there again, is not in favor of women. One seems to prefer the trajectory of young talents. So there may be doubts, hesitations, and all sorts of atypical trajectories, which have nothing to do with reality. But in this very logic, what place can be given to a woman who is or has decided to start again? I had a child at a very early age. At the age of 40, I divorced. I went back to Paris. I decided to start a job as photographer. This is how I wanted to make a living. Of course, I needed to be able to live from my work. But in the previous years, I had continued this work on a personal scale, and I used my family holidays to do this work. So there are all sorts of domestic tasks. So there is this difference between creation and procreation. What does it all mean, this radical separation between creation and procreation? There is an artistic activities which does not tolerate any coexistence with any other activity. This modus operandi, of course, excludes any other serious commitment and leaves no possibility whatsoever to maternity. Paternity, of course, is possible. This symbolic separation, which has been constructed by social consideration, has been taken on board by women photographers, but also women who work in the field of photography. They all tend to believe that pursuing an artistic life and a family is not possible. I don't have that many friends, women photographers, who have a child. They all tell me, well, why don't you wait for the age of 35 and then you'll change. We also noted out of 1,000 women who we interrogated, 55% of them have children, 76% of men have children. So a great many women abandon the idea of having children. Women photographers lack confidence, hesitate because of their social origin, or as one of them was saying, there is an excess of humility. Other 10% will be more aggressive. Men, they've been around for 2 years, and they are still around and very ambitious. There is no understanding as to their vanishing from exhibitions. It is necessary to understand the world of photography. We need to represent ourselves the artistic value of women. Now, what is required for a woman no longer be forced to say the environment is so tough. I'm always frustrated because I can no longer, I still do not understand how it works. So this crystal ceiling still exists, be it in the corporate world or be it in the artistic world. One woman told us that she thought she had a lovely career, but despite all this, there were lots of obstacles. I put in place strategy to be able to be successful. Expose in a private institution, a public institution, publish a book, and also write articles. I have the feeling that I've done everything, but I do not have the feeling that my work explodes. I no longer know what to do. What can I do? I don't have the feeling my work is recognized. One center asked me to organize workshops, but it's still teaching, and also teaching to women. There is some space on the marketplace, but it's meant for men rather than women. How can we get rid of this evidence? People are not even aware. I thought it's because your work is not worth it, and I think we all have this doubt as to our work. Now, on the basis of these results, let me clarify the different thrusts of my research. Describe the trajectories of various women. How do women face this discrimination? Which strategies do they develop? Propose new working possibilities to be recognized as women photographers and to be on balance with men. So in the course of these first discussions, I wasn't really encouraged. I was really exhausted, but a great many women are still adapting themselves to the situation despite all the obstacles. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Irène.
Thanks, Irène. Unfortunately, we have very little time. I think we can take one or two questions from the audience. Are there any reactions? Can we hand a microphone out for the questions?
Bonjour, merci.
Hello, and thank you very much for these really excellent presentations. I have a question about figures. In France, 50% of visual artists, and when we talk about visual artists, we're talking about something that goes beyond photography. So the more precarious areas of artists, videographers, sculptors, etc., and they are getting sort of social benefits. So how can we imagine that we can actually make headway as women? Because when you can't even feed your family, I don't really see how men are actually going to make room for us. I don't have figures on the French RSA, which is sort of a minimum income benefit. But we're in this situation because there's been a general across-the-board impoverishment from the difference between 1,400 euros and 1,000 euros between men and women is enormous. And we know what all the reasons are that are preventing women from advancing. And everybody's afraid. And the question is constantly raised. Are women photographers scary to those who are in a more tenuous position? And it's like a zero-sum game that somebody's taking away from somebody else. Women are not there to take the place of men. We're there to simply break apart the system and to reconfigure it with men. And thanks to men who are here today, but the situation is such that we need to rethink the whole way the system works. We're working now with iconographs. It's completely informal. So we're looking at how are we going to change within newspapers, or when there's a commission, stop forgetting about half the work. Why only men on a photograph? So we have to change things collectively. We need to have men on board. We're not taking the place of men. That's not what we're talking about. We're there to simply break down the system and to rebuild it.
Une dernière petite question.
One last question.
Bonjour et merci.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for your presentations. You were talking about the fact that women are not sufficiently visible. And you were also talking about the fact that minorities and sort of people from working class backgrounds are not visible. I'm in that situation. How can a woman of Arabic origin and of working class background can progress, or should I just give up right away? Since I did this counting exercise 5 years ago, it's obvious. And of course, I was made even more aware of it because I have friends with whom I talk about all of these problems. There are some initiatives in our groupment. We are trying to come up with a list of all the men and women who are totally invisible, but who exist. And it's deplorable. It's actually frightening to see so many of these people are not listed anywhere. We're going to make an inventory, a directory of all of you, and it's not just women. It's all of those who are invisible. We should never, ever give up. There are collectives, groups of people who are very committed. I don't know if you have listened to We Have to Make a Beautiful Society. You have to come and join us.
On terminera sur cette
I think we'll finish with this very important comment. I'd like to thank you. We're going to continue with Delphine Bedel, Anna Fox, and Anna Alix Kofi. And we'll be taking a more of an international perspective now after having taken a look at the situation in France.